All right, we are going to try something new. I'm going to see if I can get this stuff to function from a YouTube channel instead. So it'll be just a personal one for my personal email. It shouldn't matter. You should be able to have access to it if I set it to public. And we're going to try this because some people aren't having the ability to listen to the recordings if I embed them on slides. And then I had a lot of complaints about issues with if I was recording it like this, a screencast, and then sending it to you. People said the download was too long. So let's attempt this, and then if it works, I can do more flipped classroom stuff or just post these for people to use as reviews. So, all right. So we're going to go over the brain, which is like the crown jewel of Psych and AP Psych. So with this, we have this idea of the human versus animal brain, and we do a lot more comparison with like language in animals and learning abilities, and we've kind of seen that through our psychology units. But with this, it shows that our brains have changed over time or evolved, and different species have more evolved brains. With mammals, like all of these in the picture, our brains look pretty similar in some regard because we do share a lot of areas or structures or just similar, makeups, right? And so as we move from the interior functions and structures outward, we get more of that critical thinking stuff. So we could directly compare lizards, mammals, and human brains. So sometimes you might hear like the reptilian brain or the mammalian brain and then the human brain. Okay, so if you hear that kind of stuff, we have over here with our lizard brain, right? So we're talking about like the brainstem and the cerebellum. That's about all you're gonna see, and it's automatic responses for like fight or flight. So if we look at this stuff, this is why lizards can react to the world around them to some extent, but they're probably not doing critical thinking. We would not say they probably experience intense emotions or have great memories. Then we go over to the mammalian brain, which has the reptilian brain down here, but also this is unique to them, the limbic system, which we've talked about. So this is stuff like emotions, memories, habits, really good with decision making. Instead of just a fight or flight reaction of survival, this is, which one would I prefer? And then we have the human brain, and we have that beautiful neocortex on the outside, all this other additional stuff that we have. Not saying that other animals don't have a cerebral cortex, they do, but ours is unique in the fact that it gives us language, abstract thought, imagination, consciousness, morality, things like that. That other animals, we really have not seen that in too much. So we've already kind of gone over the central nervous system, right, in passing when we talked about the brain and the spinal cord. And so think of the brain like the flower sitting on top of the stem. The spinal cord blooms and expands and turns in, or inserts itself really, into the base of our brain. And so we really don't talk about the spinal cord that much beyond the fact that it's part of the central nervous system. And it's kind of, we'll talk about a piece of it. We'll talk about the brain stem. So you might hear words like hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. Those are all things we'll mention. So the hindbrain is what composes this highlighted blue section right down here. Okay, and so it includes the cerebellum and then the medulla and pons. So if we look at the brainstem, this is really where the spinal cord swells and enters the skull, and has the brain sitting on top of it in essence. It's considered the oldest part of the brain, or the central core, because with this, it's what keeps us alive, really. It's what keeps us having a heartbeat, lets us become alert to situations around us, all that kind of stuff. So if we look at the spinal cord right here, okay, you have the medulla. The medulla is kind of like, let me see if I can draw on this stuff. Apparently not. In this area right here, you have the medulla. It's this outer fleshy area, and it's in charge of basic life functions. So the medulla here, your outer side of the brainstem, this is what controls heartbeat, breathing, circulation, swallowing. And if we were to injure this, it would make sense that we'd probably die, because if we're injuring the medulla, we're not being able to control things like heartbeat and breathing, which are basic to our ability to be alive. So medulla is super important. If we look at the medulla, 1 minute here. If we look at the medulla, inside you have the reticular formation. So this outer gray area that's swallowing it up kind of, that's the medulla, especially right here, you can see it. And inside you have these two neural bands of fibers. and it's called the reticular formation. This is known for alertness and arousal, not like sexual arousal, but like it arouses your senses into the fact that like it alerts you. Alert is a better probably word for controls arousal. So this is what really makes you wake up, pay attention to things, notice things going on. And so if we damage this reason because it deals with wakefulness, people could probably be in a coma if they injured this. It wouldn't be functioning too well and making them wake up or be alert to their surroundings. And so that's what you really need to know. Yes, it modulates muscle reflexes, breathing, pain perception. That stuff we don't ask questions about. This is alertness, arousal, wakefulness. Okay, so all these brain structures are going to have tons of other functions and probably ones we haven't even discovered yet. But I'm going to try to highlight what you need to know. So alertness, arousal, wakefulness for reticular formation. The cool thing with this is it's super selective. So your reticular formation, all of us are pre-programmed just through like evolutionary traits that we would wake up to a baby crying in the middle of the night. Okay, now if you have a younger sibling at home, they're not your problem. They're your parents' problem to wake up and deal with in the night, so you can train your reticular formation to ignore the baby's cry. The first day the baby gets home, probably the first week, you'll keep waking up because you're pre-programmed. Your reticular formation says, alert, alert, there's a baby crying. But over the course of time, you train it to say, ignore that, I don't care, it's not my problem, it's somebody else's. Okay? You can also think of like if people live by a busy street or the interstate or like railroad tracks. If you've lived there your whole life, at this point, you don't even notice when a train goes by in the middle of the night, or you don't even notice the buzz of traffic because you've trained your reticular formation to shut down or just ignore it. Basically say, it's not a threat to our survival. This is something normal. I don't have to fear it. Versus if you have a friend spend the night who lives in a very quiet part of town and you live next to this busy road or these train tracks, they're going to wake up throughout the night and be like, how do you sleep through that? It's so crazy. It's so loud. You're like, oh, I don't notice it anymore. It's because you've trained your reticular formation to just kind of forget about it and ignore it. Now, if we have our medulla as this white thing, right, and then we have inside our reticular formation, there's this green band that they have highlighted here that wraps around the front called the pons. It's a bridge. It kind of holds the brainstem with the cerebellum. It hooks them all together. And so because it hooks these two areas together, it kind of does the jobs of both a little bit. It's going to do sleep and arousal because that's inside this brainstem. And then it also coordinates movements, which is the cerebellum. So the two areas it touches, it does both jobs to some extent. I have seen this one appear on the AP exam in terms of, here's a diagram, I'm pointing to this, what is this thing? And it's the pons, okay? They may ask about function, but this one, it's just a little less concrete, so know it, but I would say maybe don't worry about it strongly if you're taking the AP exam. Now, on the very, very back of your head, back here, if you feel at the bottom of your head, bottom of your skull, right above where you can almost feel your neck, your spine rise up through your neck, you have something called your cerebellum, which is called the little brain. It controls voluntary movement and balance, and it also controls memories for things like how to walk or do things like play a guitar. Coordination, voluntary movements, balance. Without this, you wouldn't be able to move smoothly, like running or dancing or playing a guitar or dribbling a basketball. So I had a very weird teacher when I was in AP psychology, and I still remember it when we talked about the cerebellum. She highlighted in this picture and said it kind of looks like a basketball in the picture. So if we think about it like basketball, if my cerebellum was damaged or I didn't have one, I wouldn't be able to dribble a basketball. I would lack the coordination and the smoothness required to do this skill. So she always said, when I go to basketball games, I always hear kids doing these like played off cheers. So if you think cerebellum, okay, it might make you think of basketball, those weird chants do cerebellum. If you think about that in a basketball game, you may remember that, yeah, I would really struggle to dribble a basketball because my cerebellum helps me do that stuff. It coordinates me, it balances me, and it helps me with voluntary movement. The other thing that the cerebellum does, if you remember Clive Wearing, the guy who had the 30-second memory, but he could still play piano. And that's because our procedural memory is housed in our cerebellum as well. So this how-to memory, any skills you know how to do or anything you've been conditioned to do, it is also housed in the cerebellum. All right, so then we can move to the midbrain. This is the segment of the brainstem that lies between the hindbrain and the forebrain, okay? And this one it contains things that integrate sensory processing. Another thing is, like, part of the limbic system is found here as well. And then if we look at the forebrain, this is just what we think of like as the human brain. It's the largest and most complex region of the brain, and it includes thalamus, hypothalamus. They consider the limbic system here to be more as part of it. And then the cerebrum, which is just the wrinkles. The cerebellum, or the cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum are the same thing. Cerebral cortex equals cerebrum. It's just the wrinkles. All of this beautiful, wavy stuff that we can look at that makes us truly human. So if we look at the brainstem here, and this pink part's supposed to be the pons, right? This is if we're looking at the back. So this would be the back of your neck, okay? And this is the front of your neck. If we look at the top of the brainstem, the thing that makes this bulb shape on top is the thalamus. Now remember, your brain has a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, which means that you have a thalamus on the left side and one on the right side as well, okay? And so the thalamus is like, have you ever seen an old movie where they have switchboard operators like this picture up top? Okay, so what these people do is, right, they have an incoming phone call and they say, hello, how do I direct your call? And they say, oh, I'm calling for this person. 1 minute, let me redirect you. They unhook the wire and transfer your call to another place. Or you can think of it like a train station where the trains all start in one place and then they get directives of where to be sent. That's kind of what happens with your brain. So when you see something, when you're processing vision, after it goes through your eyes, it goes to your thalamus, because your thalamus has to say, oh, what sense is this? Oh yeah, your vision. You need to go back to the occipital lobe, and it directs traffic there, okay? The only thing that it doesn't deal with, the only one of your senses that it does not interfere with is smell. When you smell something, it doesn't go to the thalamus. Everything but smell does, right? Vision, hearing, taste, touch, those all go through the thalamus. Smell does not. Smell goes to a different place, the olfactory bulb. So that question loves to be asked on my tests, on other people's tests, on AP exam tests. They like to say the thalamus processes all of your senses, but which one? Okay, so think of this one as like the crabby operator saying, where do you need to go? Oh, okay, let me direct your traffic, okay? So sometimes you might see it referred to as a crabby operator or a switchboard operator, things like that. It's just directing traffic in your brain, telling things where to go. Now, if we look at this picture, this is supposed to be the thalamus, okay? And then this little thing right here is the hypothalamus, okay? They are in no way alike. We've talked about the hypothalamus before because when we did the endocrine system, we said this is the boss of your entire endocrine system. And right underneath it is the pituitary gland, which is the master gland of the system. So this guy, hypothalamus, is the president. Pituitary gland is like the vice president, right? Hypothalamus controls that. But that's not actually the most important function of the hypothalamus. When we look at it, it regulates hunger, thirst, body temp, fight or flight reaction. So I remember it with the 5 F's, right? Fight, flight, feeding, fornication, and Fahrenheit. Okay? For fornication, that means sexual motivation or sex. Okay, so the 5 F's. I think fornication, if you are, a vulgar person, you can totally think of the other F word for fornication, but I'm not going to use that one because this is school. But fight, flight, feeding, fornication, Fahrenheit. That is what this is in charge of. So I can't find the video anymore, and I really wish I could. There's this great video of them doing brain surgery on a woman's hypothalamus where they're trying to figure out where her feeding center is. They want to make her less hungry because she's obese. And when they go in to do this brain surgery, they're poking around, and at one point she starts saying, woo, woo, it's getting really hot in here. I'm so hot. It's because they found on the hypothalamus, they found the part that deals with temp, and it's making her body feel like it's very, very heated up when it's not. Nothing has changed. Okay, and then they go around to another part, and then she starts saying, oh man, I want a Pepsi so bad. I think you found where that Pepsi button is in my head. I'm so thirsty. Please, please, can I have some soda? Right? And so they find these areas, and once they find her feeding center, they can adjust it. And this is that deep brain stimulation we looked at last semester. And so it's really interesting how this all kind of works together to control so many facets of your body. This is also the thing that when you are scared or in danger, it triggers fight or flight responses. So it gets that sympathetic system going, and it also kicks into your endocrine system to release like adrenaline and stuff. So it has a lot of jobs for such a small piece of the brain. Another thing it does that you need to know is the hypothalamus is related to the pleasure or reward centers of the brain. So what they do is they attach electrode to a rat's hypothalamus, and they would have this lever in the cage, and if the rat pushed the lever, it would zap this nucleus accumbens, and it's in the front of the hypothalamus. It's a piece of it, and what this thing does is it gives them a sense of reward or pleasure, like it feels awesome. And so what they noticed was these rats will stand there all day just hitting this bar. They will even go to lengths where they can put the floor as an electric grid. They have to cross over to get to the other side in order to tap this bar, and these rats are like totally worth it, not a problem. And they will go and receive shocks knowingly just to go get that bar because it feels so good, and they just want to spend the day tapping this thing. And so we think that this reward center has to do in humans with things like addiction potentially, because these rats will go to great lengths to trigger it. And so we're assuming that in humans it relates to similar behaviors when it comes to maybe things that we partake in. So if we look at the limbic system, which it's not one structure, it's a whole center structure here. We've already actually looked at it a little bit when we did our memory unit with the hippocampus and the amygdala, so we're back to that. It's a center area. And if you were to ever be asked, hypothetically, what is the function of the limbic system, you need to know that it is drives and emotions. That's what it regulates. Okay, any physical drive you may have, and also emotions. So drives, think of your hypothalamus. Okay, fight, flight, feeding, drinking, fornication, all of those are considered drives. And then emotions. So if your amygdala is there and you remember what that was about processing emotions, feeling emotions, road rage, all that kind of stuff, fear. Okay? So if we look at this and we look at where this thing is, once again, we've highlighted it here, but these definitions, they're nice, they're great, but really drives and emotions are what you need to know. So the first part we're going to look at is this weird glowing part that turns orange. I don't really like that, but it's the whole blue thing that wraps around. So if you think of it like a seahorse tail, that's actually what it's Greek for, is seahorse. Okay? And it deals with consolidation of memories. Okay, this is short-term to long-term. That's what consolidation means. Okay, if you were to have this thing break, you'd be like Clive Wearing, where you don't have the ability to form new memories, right? Nothing sticks with him. And that's why this piece of our brain is so important. Memory consolidation, short-term to long-term. Attached at the very end of our hippocampus, right? This is the swirly piece, and right on the tip, on each side, remember, you have one on each side of your brain. The left and the right both share. They each have one. You have this little almond-shaped thing called your amygdala. I always think of Angry Amy, the amygdala, because it deals with things like aggression and fear. Those are its two basic emotions that it has, but overall, the amygdala is this amazing little thing in our brain where, it can make us angry real fast, like in road rage situations. Whenever you feel a jolt of fear, your amygdala plays a part, but it also has a role in the perception of emotion. So while it lets us feel an array of emotions on our own, it's also the reason why when I look at someone's face, I can tell if they're angry or they're happy or they're sad. If I didn't have a working amygdala, I probably wouldn't be able to tell what anyone was feeling based on the look on their face. And I wouldn't also be able to feel emotion. So it's this two-way thing that your amygdala lets you do, which is super cool. So I think we've seen this picture before, but this is your amygdala in a cat, where they've attached an electrode and they've stimulated it. It's ready to fight, right? It looks scared and angry all at the same time. And we know if they take it out, the cat becomes super mellow and just super chill because it doesn't really react to anything emotionally anymore. All right, now your olfactory bulb. If you have your nose here, right behind where your eyes and nose kind of hook up in your head, you have this olfactory bulb, right? It has all these little things hanging down, all these little, almost like, they're nerve endings, but they kind of look like hairs. And so we talked about your thalamus not processing smell, and that's because smell doesn't even go there. It goes straight to the olfactory bulb in your limbic system. And this is also why smells can trigger memories. So maybe you sniff something and you're like, oh man, this candle or this smell makes me think of the smell of my grandma's house. Whenever I go over there on the holidays, her house would always smell like this. Or a perfume makes you think of a person, or just any smell that makes you trigger a memory. This is all part of the limbic system. Right? In the limbic system, we have our hippocampus and our amygdala. So we have the smell triggering a memory, and also being able to trigger an emotion because our amygdala is there too. So that's why smell is all kind of integrated in this, which is really cool. All right, now we've worked our way from the center. Now we have to go to the more human parts of the brain, all the lobes. Okay, so if we look at the frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. Let me go over those again so you know how to say them. Frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal. So if we look at the brain, it's the wrinkly surface when we talk about the cerebral cortex, right? If we talk about it, cerebral cortex, it's this big squishy thing. We've mentioned it before, how like if you held a freshly removed human brain in your hands, it's so soft that just holding it and gravity makes you leave indented fingerprints in it. Your brain is super, super fragile. Cool thing about the brain though too is it has no pain receptors on it. So when people are getting brain surgery and they're like cutting pieces of their brain and they're awake, they don't feel pain. It's not because they're on medication. It's because their brain literally feels nothing. There's no pain receptors on it, which is super cool. So when we look at this stuff, if we were to flatten out your cerebral cortex, it would be the size of like a small end table, but our brain doesn't look like that, right? We have all these other things going on where our brain is compacted, and it's because it's more efficient, right? So when we talk about why our brain looks like this, it's because we could walk around with these giant heads, but that would look ridiculous and not be very adaptive. Also, it's more efficient to store all of this matter into just a squished up area. So I've heard it described as, pretend you need to put a sleeping bag away and you can fold it up nice and put it in a closet, but it's going to be huge and bulky. But what if I gave you a bag that zipped and you just had to shove it in there any which way? It's going to look wrinkly like your brain because you're just shoving it in, but it's going to take up less space. So here's Bill Nye's version of it.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Extra, read all about it. Brain is folded to fit in skull.
No wonder your brain's in the headlines. Think of all the information it can store. Think of your brain as a newspaper. It's folded. Just think of all the words, pictures, and ideas in here. They take up a lot less room when the newspaper is folded. You know, a newspaper has a lot of information. Just look at it all.
So that's kind of the same theory of your brain, right? All of this information, all of this material is housed in this very kind of small, I mean, it's only 3 pounds, smaller than the size of your head, and it holds all of this stuff. It's just more efficient to be crammed in there like that. So when we look at the definition, or like I guess a translation of cerebral, it just means bark. So it kind of does look like bark, right? It's all this like weird shaped stuff on the outside of your brain. It is not for protection, so don't say that. I've had too many kids say, oh, it's the no, your cerebral cortex does not protect anything. Your skull has to protect that. So when it comes to our cerebral cortex, if I wanted to give a definition of its function, critical thinking. This is why you guys can do critical thinking and like reason through things, right? There's only one animal out there that has a larger cerebral cortex than us, and that would be a dolphin. And they have a larger cerebral cortex if we iron it out, and they have more wrinkles. But we're still unique in our abilities. So our brain is broken up into 4 different lobes that we're going to go over. So when we look at how these wiggles are formed, these wrinkles, right, they have the gyri and the sulci, right? So I remember that the gyri, I don't have a fun way to remember that one, but I do remember that the sulci is the bottom one, or the sulcus, because when I sulk, I'm sad, right, or I'm pouting, and so I'm down in the dumps, and I think of my whole demeanor like hanging down and being just laying around and drooping, okay, and that's how I remember what the sulcus is. It's sulking. It's down in the dips. So this is just the folds and valleys that we have on our cerebral cortex. Now, another thing to talk about when we talk about the brain is our brain is separated, our cerebral cortex is separated into 2 hemispheres, right? There's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and it's divided by something called a longitudinal fissure. They talked about it the other day in the video we watched in one of our classes, and how it's like a millimeter, a couple millimeters in between the hemispheres. It's not a huge gap, right? And so with this gap, we'll talk about it. It goes down until we hit right around the limbic system. Right before we get to the limbic system, the gap is almost all the way to that point. So if we look at the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, we need to know, controls the left side of our body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of our body. So if we look at the cerebral cortex, if we stuck a pencil, hypothetically, down the center, down that longitudinal fissure, we would run into this very tough band of neural fibers called the corpus callosum. Okay? What it does is it's a bridge. It's a connector between the right and the left hemisphere. It lets them talk to each other, which is something we don't see very often. We do see it often, sorry. We don't see it get cut very often, which we'll talk about later with split brain operation. We do see them talk to each other a lot because they constantly have to be comparing notes. What did you see? What did I hear? What did you do? Right? And they're always kind of in sync with each other. So we'll talk about the corpus callosum more when we get to split brain procedures. First, we're going to tackle the lobes. So if we look at the frontal lobe here, with this is your executive function. It tells you what choices to make in essence. So its big thing is reasoning, planning, and judgment. That is all stuff that's located there. The reason you can make a plan of action. What are we going to do to get this project done? What are the steps we need to take? What do I want to do this weekend? Let me plan it out. Okay, reasoning. Okay, do I want to make this choice or that choice, and why? And then judgment. Is this a good choice? Is it a bad choice? Right? Will this affect me in this way or that? It also is an emotional control center. So your limbic system that's pumping out all these emotions, your frontal lobe is what tells it to chill out when it needs to. Okay, so your frontal lobe is there. It's not developed all the way till you're like 25 or 30. And so it makes sense why little children, when my 4-year-old has an outburst and he's freaking out and it's not an appropriate outburst, he needs to chill because that's not acceptable. His frontal lobe doesn't have the power yet to tell him to hush. Same with teenagers. You guys still sometimes have emotional outbursts because your frontal lobe is not formed and can't say, hey, calm down. So hopefully I'm at an age now, my brain has developed as much as it's going to, and if I'm upset with somebody, I have the constraints and the emotional control to tell them, I know I'm angry right now, but that's not how I can act. I need to tone it down. I need to calm down. I know I can't act that way. So it helps me keep those things in check. Expressive languages here, as we'll talk about, the Broca's area is on the frontal lobe, which means this is what gives us the ability to talk. Personality is thought to live there. So if we injure our frontal lobe, we can lead to personality changes. The motor strip is there, which allows our whole body to move voluntarily. People think humor is in the right frontal lobe. But then we can't talk about the frontal lobe without talking about Phineas Gage, which you guys definitely already know about. And there's videos that I will post that go along with the tale of Phineas Gage. But what happens with Phineas Gage is he has a tamping iron go through his face and his head. Right? He's working, and all of a sudden it goes through his cheek, out the top of his head, like this picture so lovely shows, and he didn't die. He was still talking after it. I know you guys read a book in 7th grade about Phineas Gage, so you guys usually already remember the story. And after it, he walked away from it. He was, bleeding and definitely a medical emergency, but he was talking, and he was still awake, and he was still alive, and people didn't understand. And at one point, the doctor says, oh my gosh, I can feel my other hand through his head. It's just this giant hole. And it healed up, but Phineas Gage's personality changed, and he no longer could control emotions. It was kind of like it disconnected his frontal lobe from his limbic system, so he went back to being very childlike. When he'd have an outburst, instead of being an adult and being I can't act like that, he would just go for it. He would have his tantrums, he would freak out, he would be inappropriate, because he didn't understand that it wasn't okay. And he had a severe personality change where he used to be a really personable guy, really chill, good leader, and now he struggled socially, and it was rough on him. He lived the end of his life, which wasn't, I think he lived 10, 15 years after his accident. He still died relatively young. He spent most of his time with animals. He just couldn't figure out how to deal with people anymore, which was really hard for him. So they did find this picture in the archive somebody was looking through, and that is Phineas Gage, and this is the tamping iron that went through his face. His skull and the tamping iron is actually on display. I can't remember what medical university it's at, but yeah, you can totally go see it. And he's a great case study for what happens when you sever the frontal lobe from limbic system. This is kind of what frontal lobotomies used to be like. They used to cut into the frontal lobe until the person was quiet and weren't manic anymore or talking or being reactive to things, because it's separated everything and drastically changed their ability to react. So Phineas Gage is a great study. I'll post the video from another YouTube channel that has it on. And then we have the parietal lobe. So frontal lobe here, if you go to the very back part of the top of your head, that is the parietal lobe. And so this is concerned with touch, pressure, pain, temp. So the parietal lobe is always one where I discuss, if you reach into your pocket and you had a piece of gum and a key, you know how to know the difference, right? You could reach in your pocket and I'd say, oh, grab the key without looking. You would know how to do that. That's because you can process touch. Your sensory receptors are processing all that stuff. With the parietal lobe, that's its function. The sensory strip is there so you have these abilities. Or they can call it the somatosensory cortex. It's the same thing. It lets you process touch. And then another thing that the parietal can do, we can talk about mathematical reasoning, integration of memory, but the biggest thing you have to know is touch. On the very, very back of your head, right above your cerebellum, you're going to have your occipital lobe. It's the very back, and I always think of I always was told moms have eyes in the back of their head, or teachers do. So it's true though, we all have eyes in the back of our head because our occipital lobe processes vision. So think about it as having eyes in the back of your head. Your occipital lobe, the whole thing isn't used for vision, but it does contain the visual cortex in the center back of it. And so remember, you still have a right occipital lobe and a left occipital lobe, but they do both have the visual cortexes there that help you process vision. So when your eyes pick up something, the thalamus gets it first. The thalamus says, hey, your vision, you need to go to the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe specifically gears it towards the visual cortex to process what you're seeing. So they've done this cool things where in a functional MRI scan, they show the visual cortex is active when a subject's looking at faces. So they can have them look at things and they can see what area of the brain. So this one is an fMRI, and it's glowing right here to show when they made them do this task, this is where the activity was. Then we have the temporal lobe. The biggest thing for the temporal lobe is the auditory cortex. So if you feel your temples, right? You know where your temples are. They're on the sides of your head. Right near your ears. Well, that's where your temporal lobe is. Your temporal lobe is right underneath where your ears are. And it is no coincidence that right underneath there, that's where hearing is processed. Okay, so this is it's all processing of hearing. It also contains the area where we comprehend speech. The Wernicke's area is here, which we'll talk about more. But with this stuff, the biggest thing about temporal lobe, hearing. Auditory cortex is there. The temporal lobe lets us hear. So when they showed the auditory cortex of people who were having auditory hallucinations, so like somebody who was schizophrenic, when they were scanning them while they said, oh, I hear voices talking to me, their auditory cortex was actually lit up because they were hearing things. They were processing sound, even though the sounds were definitely just coming from a psychological disorder. Same thing could happen if I stimulated the visual cortex of someone. They would see stuff that wasn't there, or if I zapped the auditory cortex, they would hear things. So that's where you process both of these senses. Now, on our frontal lobe and our parietal lobe, we have these unique cortexes. We have the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. The motor cortex is over here and it's for movement, and the sensory cortex, they have it in purple here, and it's for touch sensations. So with these, you have maps of your body on both. Now, if you look at the map of this person's body, that's how ours is laid out. It doesn't really follow the shape of a human body, right? It doesn't start with your head and go down to your foot. It's all messed up. And if you look at it, all the different sizes of things on here are way weird. They don't match up. Look at how big the thumb is compared to like the arm. So motor cortex over here, we'll start with this one. Make sure. So what happens here is the motor cortex deals with movement. It's on the very, very back of the frontal lobe. This is the last piece of the frontal lobe, the motor cortex. And so if I want to wiggle my right foot, right, I would go to my left hemisphere on my motor cortex, and right down here, I would wiggle my foot, okay? Or if I wanted to wiggle my thumb on my left hand, I'd go to the right motor cortex and find the thumb area, and this part would be lighting up, all right? And so the reason why they're all odd shapes is because different parts of your body need to be able to do finer motor movements. My thumb needs to do a lot more specific, intricate movement so it gets more space on this cortex than my entire arm. There's not a lot of things I can do with my arm, right? I can move it up and down. I can do like a chicken wing thing. That's about it. It's not as complex as my entire hand, or especially my thumb. Same with on this picture, the face, right? My forehead doesn't need a lot of space. I don't move my forehead that much, right? I can move the skin a little bit on it, but honestly, not much. My eye, nope, don't need a ton of space there, but my lips do. My lips need a ton of space because that's what allows me to form language. They need to be able to do very intricate movements, so it gets more space. The bigger the feature on these, they call them homunculuses, these bodies, the bigger the pieces are on it, the more space on the cortex they get. And so I had mentioned the motor cortex before because when we talked about transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, I talked about playing in my aunt's machine and how I made her zap my motor cortex and she could get my thumb to twitch. And that would be because she was scanning my motor cortex and just poking around until she found it. She had to find the section that was my thumb, which gave her a fair shot because it was really, really big, right? And so when she zapped it, she could make my thumb move without me actually telling it to, because it was sending electrical current or magnetic pulses to my motor cortex where my thumb was located on it. Now your sensory cortex, or the somatosensory, it is on the front of the parietal. So the motor and the somatosensory, they butt up next to each other. The motor is signaling that is the last section of the frontal lobe. The sensory cortex is signaling this is the beginning of the parietal lobe. And so this one doesn't deal with movement, it processes touch. Okay, so there's a lot of different, once again, body parts here in different shapes because it lets us know how much sensation. So once again, look at the lips on this one. The lips are massive. Okay, that's because we eat with our lips, right? And so when we are processing like the touch of food and stuff, it's important for us to be able to sense that. It's also the reason why humans like kissing so much, because there's a lot of sensory receptors on our mouth, right? And our thumb as well. Our thumb, when we go to touch things, think of like your phone. When you are texting, you're using your thumbs like crazy. So you're using the motor agility, but you're also using the sensation. Same with when you touch something, you touch things with your fingertips. So your fingers get a lot of space versus your forearm here or your wrist, your forearm especially though. Your forearm doesn't get much stuff. You don't go around touching stuff with your forearm. You touch it with your hands. Your forearm doesn't need to have a lot of real estate on there. It's not necessary. So things that aren't important to processing touch as much, they don't get as much space. So we talked about how, like, if you've ever played the game where somebody walks up your arm without you looking, they walk from your wrist to your elbow, and you have to tell them to stop when they get to your elbow. People have a lot of trouble doing that, and that's just because the further away from your hand you get, the less sensory receptors there are. So, yeah, you can't feel it. So sensory receptor or sensory cortex processes things like tickle, pain, pleasure, just overall touch sensations. So here's another drawing of the homunculuses for the motor and sensory. Now remember, this keeps just showing one side. You have a left side and a right side motor cortex, and a left side and a right side sensory cortex. And they're just one after the other. Now another thing we have on only the left side of our brain, this is so unique. Everything else I've talked to you about, we've had one on the right and one on the left, right? Each hemisphere has its own, except speech areas. These are unique to the left side of the brain. Okay, so when we look at the centers and problems with them, we can use the word aphasia. Aphasia just means some impairment in language. So it might mean they have trouble forming language. It might mean they have trouble comprehending or understanding language. Okay, either one counts as aphasia. It's a very generalized term for somebody not being able to do something with language. Okay, so if we look at the Broca's area right here, okay, the Broca's area is in the frontal lobe only on the left side. Now the Broca's area, this prevents a person from producing speech if it's ruined, right? So mine's working, I'm talking to you right now. Everything I'm saying, all these words I'm forming, It's because my Broca's area is functioning. Now, if I were to go have brain surgery and the surgeon messed up and ruined or destroyed my Broca's area, I would not be able to speak anymore. Often it's not surgeries that ruin these things, it's strokes. So with this Broca's area, the first guy that ever was discovered with it, and they kind of, the surgeon, the guy's name was Broca, the doctor who discovered this guy, they nicknamed him Tan-Tan. Tan-Tan had suffered a stroke, and after his stroke, he could only say tan. It's the only verb, only syllable he could say to everything. What's your name? Tan. Where do you live? Tan. That's the only thing his mouth could form. Now, if you asked him to write stuff out, fine. As long as he wasn't paralyzed, he could write all this stuff out, totally fine. Wasn't a problem. So he just lacked the ability to form words. It didn't mean he didn't know language. He could comprehend everything you said. He could write it out. His body just would not let his mouth form words. Now, Wernicke's. The Wernicke's is in the left temporal lobe, okay? And this is comprehension of speech. So when you ask me a question or ask me to do something, I comprehend it because of my Wernicke's area. So it could be something like, the lion was killed by the tiger. Which cat died? The reason you can think about that and understand and answer my question is because your Wernicke's area lets you do it. So these people, they can sometimes speak, but their words they're saying, they're just not in the right order. Their thoughts don't make sense. And then when you ask them questions, they can't really answer them. So we're going to look at this example of Wernicke's aphasia. Because Broca's is pretty easy to understand. The person will just say syllables that aren't real words, or they might not even be able to form words, and they just might make yelling noises or kind of like they're mutes, where they're just kind of moaning. Versus this is what very severe Wernicke's aphasia might look like in this person.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment. Talk with the people over them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
sort it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes.
So even her asking what they did with the iPad, he looks back outside because he doesn't understand. She's asking what do we do with the iPad. So not only can he not comprehend language, he also isn't making language we can comprehend because all of his words are kind of out of sorts and his speech isn't making sense, even though he's saying actual English words, right? So that's what Wernicke's aphasia would look like if like this guy, he had his Wernicke's area damaged due to a stroke. So if we look at all the different brain parts and how they light up when we stick you in an fMRI machine, we can see all the different areas light up as we see them. So hearing words, our temporal lights up, speaking words, our frontal lobe, seeing words, our visual, and then thinking about words, and whatever it's thinking about meanings or just thinking words, lights up our frontal lobe. Now, your brain is super cool. We've talked about this before. Our brain is all about plasticity. When you injure your brain, you have the ability to regain some of that back to some extent. So if somebody goes and has, so my mom, she's had a TBI from falling off a retaining wall and smacking her head on cement, gave her a TBI. And after that, her short-term memory, it's still really bad, but it was way worse after the accident. And as she came back from it, her memory improved a little bit, or her sense of smell and taste were gone after she hit her head. But then over the course of time, after a year, those things came back. And it's because her brain was repairing itself. Anytime we have an injury or illness, our brain attempts to either repair what's broken to some extent or modify. How do I get these skills back to some extent, even if it means utilizing different parts or different pathways that I've not used before? Your brain is very into evolving and trying to problem solve on how to make you better. So I always think this is a really good little video about neuroplasticity and just how we look at like those fattening of the arrows that I keep talking about. This is the video that kind of always reminds me of.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So rewiring can happen because you choose to, or it can happen because you've injured a part of your brain and it has to compensate for this. Okay, so we're going to end this one here because I'm going to talk about corpus callosum and all of that in the split brain lecture in case you just want to skip to that. So, all right, you can go back through here and review the brain and its amazing abilities along with all of its features, and hopefully this stuff is going to be helpful for review or if you are missing class. All right, thanks guys.